Huh?
It's been good so far.
All right. Now, most of what we know about the American Indians comes from archaeology. I had written that word down and you started to erase it. Archaeology, because the ones in what is today the United States, did not have written records. Now, history is primarily made up of written records. Persons will read the records and try to make sense of them. But the American, and now, there were exceptions. The Aztecs had writing, the Mayans had writing, and the Inca had a form of record keeping using beads, actually using string that they tie knots in, and the knots represented certain words. But the ones living in what is today the 48 states do not seem to have had written records. Now again, folks, it depends on what, excuse me, depends on what books you read. There are persons who say that they have found writing and some of the stones that were made by the Indians, that the Indians may have once had writing and lost it. If they wrote on stone, we still can find it. If they wrote on paper, or wrote on skins, wrote on leather, a lot of the writing might have long since disappeared. But now, your book will mention that there are persons who disagree with the standard theory, and I have read many a story about where the American Indians came from. When Montezuma met Cortez, he told him that we sailed across the ocean. It appears like in a lot of cases that's what they did. And folk, if I wanted to, we could spend the entire semester talking about the American Indians. Some history courses they do, and I could put you into a state of total confusion because I'm there myself. The evidence is contradictory. The evidence shows almost everything, except there's almost no evidence that they came across across from Siberia to Alaska. No Indian told us that. They all say that they came across the ocean, and again, we now know that you can cross the ocean in small boats and canoes, which might explain why they had no cattle, no sheep, no horses. The only beast of burden that they had in Peru, they had the llama. They did have the dog. I'm not even sure if they had the cat. Among plant life, they had no wheat, rye, oats, barley, no grains. Now, they did, all right, the original Indians, I actually erased this and I shouldn't have. The Clovis Point, they hunted mammoths and bison. The bison in those days was much larger than the bison we have today. The bison skeletons we find are often as big as elephants. Today's buffalo are much smaller.
Is that based on this region, or just over time they just adapted to become smaller?
It appears that over time they adapted and became smaller. In other words, the buffalo we have today are descended from these huge bison that once were as big as elephants. And also right here in this part of Georgia, they had a sloth that was as big as an elephant.
Wow.
This you can find, particularly if you go to the University of Georgia, they had what some of the students thought was a dinosaur bone. No, it was the bones of a giant sloth that was as big as an elephant. All right.
So I guess the sloths were communists too.
What's that? The sloth. I'll tell you something, folk. They declined over time. Now, we're about to get into another topic, which I thought about saving until we come to the 1925 Scopes trial. Evolution calls for life going upward. The actual evidence seems to indicate that life went downward. Today's trees are not as big as the trees used to have gotten. Today's animal life seems to be smaller than the animal life used to be. And even human bones that Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man was bigger than the average modern man, and he had a bigger brain capacity than modern man. And I have a book that was written 52 years ago that actually asks the question, is it possible that modern man is a degenerate? And this book was my zoology, it was very pro-evolution. And yet wondered if modern man was not in a state of decline. Again, when it comes to the Scopes trial, in a few weeks I want to talk more about this. The fossil record shows a layer at the bottom of what you call virgin soil, no life, and the next layer up has all the phyla of plants and animals just appearing, boom, all of a sudden. Well, recently I read that shows that some kind of a catastrophe just washed that whole layer away. No, the layer never existed. Life appeared on the earth suddenly, and all the phyla appeared all at once, all at the same time. That's what the evidence shows. And also the fossils show better life than today's life, bigger life than today's life. Mostly bigger anyway. I mean, okay, the largest animal we find is the blue whale, and it still exists. But for the most part, the fossil record shows that life back then was better and stronger than today's life. And a whole lot, more than 94% of the species that once were on the earth no longer exist, and no, it was not man that wiped them out. Nature itself has wiped out more than 90% of the species. And some of these species we thought were extinct are finding their way back. All right. Again, I got to ask you, before we proceed, when does any scientific point become so well established and so firmly proven that you never ever question anymore? This proven fact, and never. When does this happen in a field of knowledge?
Over time.
Over time? Anybody else?
I don't think it ever happens. I think it's constant.
Listen, I learned this in junior high school. I'm surprised how many college students do not know how to answer that question. No matter of scientific fact is ever so firmly proven, you never question it anymore. In a field of law, there's such a thing as case closed, and I respect that. That applies to humans, and humans are not scientific subject. There's such a thing in the field as case closed, or innocent until proven guilty, or double jeopardy. I agree with it in the field of law. In a case of science, if you haven't proven what you think the first time, you can prove it over and over and over and keep on. There's no such thing as if you don't prove it the first time, you can't prove it again. And yet a lot of persons are acting like, particularly when it comes to climate change, that this is something you can. People have been fired for questioning the modern theories on climate change. And a man was fired from the Smithsonian a few years back for questioning evolution. Today's scientists are not open-minded. Yes?
Even to your point, in reference to that, because I think, I don't know, in Mills, I don't know if you're familiar with Mills back in the Earth Factory, I think he was around with Thomas Jefferson and all the guys before they wrote it. He believed that if your point of view, if you don't have the open mind state to have your point of view be debated,
Yeah.
you're not entitled to even have a point of view because you become so dogmatic about it that you're almost like an idiot.
Very, very good point.
Right, so just like to your point.
Yeah. But the biggest discoveries that we've made have been made by people who said, I disagree.
Yes.
When Colonel Drake said oil can be drilled far underground, they laughed. They called it Drake's Folly. He drilled a well, and after a while, oil rushed up. Without it, we would not, I mean, there's not enough whales in the world to fly all of our airplanes and all of our trains and all of our automobiles. Without it, we'd have none of this stuff. When Robert Fulton put a steam engine on a boat, they called it Fulton's Folly. They laughed at him. A professor wrote in 1903 that man could not fly a heavier than air machine. He used mathematics. His math was wrong. That same year, two boys from Ohio, young men, I mean, I'm so old that anyone under 50 looks like a boy. Anyway, two young men from Ohio flew a heavier than air machine. Oh, yes. You have to allow the freedom to disagree.
Yeah.
And if you don't, well, anyway. All right, anyway, the American Indians, they, what we know about them comes from archaeology, and again, it's debatable. Eventually, they started using the bow and arrow. Yeah, they had the bow and the arrow, even as the Europeans did. Now, as to where they lived, there was the woodland Indians in eastern North America. That's the Indians that were over here in Georgia, and that includes the ones in Georgia all the way up through Pennsylvania and New England, and the eastern Indians were called woodland. They tended to live in what you call wigwams. A wigwam is shaped somewhat like an old-fashioned bread quilt. I'll try to draw it like this. And several families would live in these. They would take trees and bend them over and then join the tops together and then cover between the tree branches and put bark. And they could make a pretty dry dwelling place. That's my drawing of a wigwam as best as I can draw one really fast. But the woodland Indians, then there were the Great Plains Indians. The Great Plains Indians lived in teepees. And over a teepee, triangular shape, shaped somewhat like our modern tent. They would put together several sticks and tie the sticks together at the top, and then surround the sticks with buffalo hides, and sew the buffalo hides together again with other buffalo hides. And they would use buffalo bones as needles. That was the Great Plains Indians. Now, your book has something, folk, that unless you're careful, you won't notice it. On page 15, women were in charge of the Society of the Great Plains. And that's going to be one of the questions you'll be asking you to write about on your test, women being in charge. We are fast approaching the feminization of America right now. Each of you will have to decide for yourself whether this is good or bad. And hey, I'll say this about women. I'm married to one. I've been married for more than 30 years. Never experienced divorce. I mean, yes, I got married late. I have 2 daughters. I like women. But in general, they are not capable of leading. If you don't like what I just said, I don't like it either. But but anyway, the societies where the women have been in charge have wound up being overrun and conquered by their enemies.
So you said the American Indian women were in charge?
Particularly the ones in the Great Plains, we know for sure, for certain. I mean, that's in your book. Yes, they had that. Anyway, yes?
What about Germany right now in England?
I'm not, okay. A point I really want to make, if a woman can handle it, I say that I would vote for a woman for president. Let me tell you, I taught 10-year-olds for 5 years. And we'd go out and play softball once in a while, and sometimes, we'd choose up sides. When the boys chose up sides, they could make a competitive game out of it. 2 equal teams. When you let a girl choose, they would pick their little girlfriends first. They'd pick the boys last, and then they'd make up a lineup where they put the boys at the back end of the lineup. And if you know anything at all about softball, you've got to put your best players at the front. And bunch your best players together so they can get each other around the base, and put your worst players. This is true even in the major leagues. Very true. Well, they would put their little girlfriends at the front of the order, and the result, if you put them, now, they were not all that way. One 10-year-old girl out of 30, I had about 3 or 4 in the 5 years I taught, would actually pick like a boy. If she can, and of course, I've read some years back of what's called the Queen Bee Syndrome. The women who actually get at the top know when they're picking their subordinates, they'll usually pick men. When they have a chance to pick, they'll pick the men. And they call it the queen bee syndrome, that I'm the only woman who's capable and qualified, and the rest of you women are not, so I'm going to surround myself with men. All right, if I'm wrong, you're welcome to say so, and if you don't like what I'm saying, I mean, hey, folk, it's my own observation. The societies where the women take charge wind up being overthrown, overrun, and conquered and overpowered by their enemies. And this is proven to be true time and time again. And Merkel in Germany is having a really tough time right now and is about to be overthrown, legally, I hope. Not in a bloody coup, but legally. Now, Golda Meir, who ran Israel, oh, she was a good one. Golda Meir ran Israel when I was about your age. She was a Milwaukee school teacher, went to Israel and had Israeli citizenship. We saw her on the news. I was watching news one time during the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, and one of the young men spoke up and said, I tell you, that woman has got to be the ugliest woman on the face of the earth. She led Israel to victory over their enemies. But she said the Arab, she said, we can forgive you for killing our sons, but we cannot forgive you for making us kill your sons. All right. Anyway, that's the topic for a later time. But anyway, that's in your book, folks, that the Great Plains Indians were headed up by women. It's called a matriarchy. All right, now that I've gotten this far, folks, I've got another little speech to make. Some of you might decide by the end of this class you don't want to stay. Let me ask a favor of you. If you don't want to come back to this class, please go through the formality of actually dropping. Because if you drop, you're allowed 3 drops. And the 4th drop, I mean, you're not allowed. This 4th drop counts. But you're allowed 3 drops that do not count on your way up to a degree. But if you don't drop, and you've been to class and you don't drop, all I can do is give you an F, folks. That's it. That's the rules of the game. So go through the formality of dropping if you want to withdraw from the class. And believe me, at the end of every first class I teach, some of you will not come back. And I've gotten kind of used to that now. I mean, I heard a part-time man say, why do I take this so... I used to take it personally myself, but I guess I'm hardened to it now. But anyway, if you don't like what you see or hear from me and you can't stand it, do me a favor and go through the formality of withdrawing. All right. Anyway, now, something your book does not say, but it is in one of the other books. Their average lifespan of the Indian appears to have been 18 years. Now, you might wonder, what brings the average down? And of course, I just went over averages a few minutes ago. Zeros. A lot of them died in infancy. They had a very high infant mortality rate. Again, that helped bring their, but even the ones who lived 10 years, the average person among the Indians died before they were 40. And yet, like everybody else, there's some of those scholars show they had persons who lived to be 100. Every generation and every society has produced people who live to be 100. Today, with our modern medicine and modern food, we have more people reaching that. But something you said about decline, for the first time in American history, the average lifespan of Americans at death is going down. And a lot of the blame goes to opioids, among other things. All right. Anyway, yes?
What's matriarchy?
What do you say?
What is matriarchy?
Oh, matriarchy, where the woman is in charge. The woman is at the top. Yeah, not only head of a nation, head of the whole household, head of everything. That's a matriarchy. Okay. All right, moving on. Chapter 2. I've taken longer than I intended to. Chapter 2. Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella were both born the same year. I mean, this is, I say this because your book opens up with a big net about both of them. Now, your book says that Christopher Columbus was born into poverty. Folks, this has come into serious question by some authors because Christopher Columbus married into royalty. And persons who are born into poverty they might say, how is it royalty? All right, a noble couple died, and Prince Henry, who was the fourth son of the King of Portugal, Prince Henry never got to be king because he was not the oldest son, but Prince Henry adopted their daughter, and Columbus married the adopted daughter of Prince Henry. So he married into royalty, and he knew his way around royalty. I mean, he went to the King of Portugal first, then he went to the King and Queen of Spain. Common people just don't go up to the king. But nevertheless, the standard view, which I will mention at least, not that I agree with, it says that Columbus was born in poverty in Genoa, and that Columbus worked his way from poverty up to the nobility by doing some great deed. But anyway, they were born in the same year. Now, your book does mention that in the year 1000, the first Europeans we know of came across the ocean. They were the Vikings. The Vikings settled in Nova Scotia. The Vikings first went to Iceland. Some of them went from Iceland to Greenland, and then they went from Greenland to Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, they encountered the Indians. Now, this was not like it became 500 years later. The Vikings were no match for the Indians. Brave though they were, the Vikings had iron swords and iron helmets, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and they had to leave after 10 years. And again, the Indians apparently drove them out. Now, 500 years later, kings and queens got involved, and big ships got involved, and gunpowder got involved. And but the Vikings had none of this. Now, something I want to say about the Vikings. Greenland. It is named Greenland, folk, because it was in fact a green land. It was not named Greenland as a misnamed number to get people to come in. No, the Vikings, when they moved to Greenland, they farmed in Greenland just like they had farmed back in Scandinavia. This is in the records. They came into what's called the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages were as hot as a firecracker. And the grapes that they grew in Nova Scotia are grapes that now can't be grown any farther north than New Jersey. If anything, if you probably know anything about plant life, you have to have a certain amount of warm weather to grow plants. And some of you might not be aware that right here in Georgia last year, the March freeze that came in killed a lot of Georgia's blueberry and peach crop. Most of you, some of you nodding your head like you've heard this already. This is global warming for you, the freeze. Now, I was talking to the cop who let me in. The weatherman is predicting no more than a few snowflakes tomorrow morning. It's only been 13 months ago the weatherman did the same thing, and some of you might remember the results. About 13 and a half months ago, the weatherman, even as late as 8 o'clock that morning, they still weren't, and even as late as 10 o'clock they weren't, and then finally they had to predict it by noon because it was already down. 8 inches of snow, some of you might remember, those of you who weren't here. It fell in December, on December 8th, 2017. I mean, and it was not predicted. All right, I'll leave that. But anyway, Greenland was a green land. And then all of a sudden, a hard freeze came down, I mean a permanent freeze, and wiped out the Viking colony. The Vikings could have survived if they had done one thing. They needed to make friends with the Eskimos, and copy the Eskimos. Instead, they looked on the Eskimos being demons. And they wouldn't have anything to do with the Eskimos. The Eskimos were very hospitable and willing to help. It's believed that anyway. The Vikings perished. This was due to a hard freeze that came after and the point I was trying to make is, it is believed that the High Middle Ages were much hotter than what we've experienced now. And what we're living in is still an ice age that's slowly warming up and may turn around any time. All right. Now, the cooling down in Europe brought on the Black Death. The Black Death carried away 1/3 of Europe's population. And I want to elaborate on that a little bit. The Black Death appears to have been caused, among other things, by cooling. Now, your book doesn't emphasize that so much, The standard view is that rats came from, Genghis Khan came from Mongolia, rats followed his camp, and a certain kind of rat carried a certain kind of flea, and this flea was so particular about which host it, that it would only affect certain kind of rats and humans. It would not infect cats, and would not even infect the other kind of rat. It eventually drove the black rat. Well, the black rat was a type of flea that, the black rat was a type of rat that carried these fleas. And the brown rat, these fleas would not infect the brown rat. Now, something I just learned less than a year ago. Very disastrous for Europeans. One of the popes, Pope Gregory VII, said that cats were of the devil and ordered the killing of European cats. When the Black Death hit Europe, two types of people tended to not catch it: old maids and Jews. All of you, I think, know that old maids tend to have around their dwelling place what? Cats. As for the Jews, they felt, oh, we're not under the authority of the Pope anyway, we don't believe in that. They wouldn't kill their cats. So both groups were hated. The Jews were looked on as being witches, and they were hated, and the old maids were looked on as being witches, and they were hated also. When actually, all that the rest of Europe needed was cats. And it's known that there was a scarcity of cats in Europe at this time. Again, I mean, you know, people have made mistakes from time to time, and this was one of them. Anyway, the climate cooled. That meant that they'd plant their crops, and the frost would get their crops. Before, I mean, when years by, they could plant a crop and know when the last frost would come, or they'd plant a crop, and if the frost didn't get in the spring, the frost would get it before harvest time. And Europeans were starving. And this brought lowered resistance and killed a third of the population. And oh yeah, there came a popular song that you might have sung in elementary school, Ring Around the Roses, pockets full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. You know. Came about during the Black Death. They believed that putting flowers in their pockets could ward off the plague. Anyway, oh yeah. Now, the Black Death, though, had one positive effect on Europeans. It made them less fearful of death, since they saw it all the time. And also it meant Europeans who survived oftentimes would inherit large fortunes that they were not expected to inherit because the persons who were supposed to inherit them had died. And the Black Death, by the way, carried up nobility, aristocrats, and commoners alike. And a lot of people got fortunes who otherwise would not have gotten them, but there was basically more wealth per person. And also, the nobility who hired commoners to work had to pay higher wages because there were so few laborers, so wages went up. So this meant that the ones who survived were better off than they might have been had they not survived. But anyway, some of them started exploring, particularly Henry the Navigator. I've already mentioned he was the fourth son of the king, so he never got to be king. The king was John, and then when King John died, Henry's older brother, also named John, but Henry the Navigator encouraged his sailors to explore. So they went farther and farther south of Africa. Now, the Portuguese knew the world was round. In fact, the idea that the people of Columbus's day believed the earth was flat, folk, this is really not so. Your book even mentioned everybody who was educated knew the earth was round, but they wondered, does Africa ever end, or does it go all the way around the globe, and can we get around it? Well, finally, a sailor named Diaz, Bartholomew Diaz, sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. I mean, he sailed to the Cape of Good Hope, but he didn't sail around. We got to and said, yes, Africa comes to an end. We found the end of it. So a few years later, Vasco da Gama went all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and went to India. Went to India, offloaded his goods and loaded up a bunch of spices and whatever from India, and came home and proved that you could get around Africa. Well, along came Columbus, and he said, well, we can get to Africa by sailing west. See, the problem with going around India was the Muslim world at that time controlled the Indian Ocean. But Columbus said, we can bypass the Muslim world and sail west. So Columbus begged the king for 3 small ships, which the king wouldn't give. Finally, Queen Isabella helped. And again, there's stories about how she was persuaded to help. Columbus left her and went on to, he's going to talk to the King of France next, but she sent a man on a fast horse to overtake Columbus. Say, come back, the Queen wants to talk to you. Anyway, she gave him 3 really old bad ships. Columbus sailed west, bumped into the West Indies Islands, called the people he met there at Tanos, and took 7 of them back into Europe. And as far as I know, the 7 he took never came back to the old world. But anyway, he aroused the interest, and unlike the Vikings, when Columbus' second voyage, he had 17 ships with him. Here's a bad part of the story. When Columbus did not have a very good crew. In fact, Queen Isabella gave him a bunch of prisoners, and they were not Europe's best. Gave him a bunch of prisoners and convicts, said, I'll commute your sentence if you go. And Columbus one day put an 11-year-old boy at the helm of the Santa Maria, operating the Santa Maria's big steering wheel. And this 11-year-old boy dashed the Santa Maria to pieces. He came to a point where 2 oceans came together. He couldn't handle the currents. He dashed the Santa Maria to pieces. So Columbus had to leave some of his men behind. When Columbus came back, he found all the men left behind were slaughtered, gone. This was to set the stage for 400 years of conflict. It appears that the Indians drew the first blood, even though like I say, the men Columbus left behind were convicts, were not Europe's best. They were possibly bad men. They may have provoked it. Whatever happened, Columbus's men were very much enraged, and they went on a killing rampage. Then there were diseases. The diseases did not go both ways. Now, I just researched this last night. Some people believe that syphilis was spread by the Indians to one of Columbus's crewmen who carried it back to Europe. This is widespread, the widespread belief. Others say no, syphilis was actually in Europe before Columbus. We don't know where syphilis came from, but the diseases went both ways. But the diseases, now a lot of persons blame Columbus for spreading diseases like smallpox and typhus among the Indians. Oh, Columbus could not have helped this. The Indians had no immunity whatever to these diseases. Europeans and Africans did. People who raised cattle do not get smallpox. The Indians had no cattle. Africans did, Europeans did, the Chinese did, the Japanese did. But cattle, if you have raised cattle, you get cowpox. That immunizes against smallpox. All right.